Hi, grade nines. I'm looking at the homework questions from week 3. I thought I'd do a video solution. Hopefully that will be a little bit more clear to you than just looking at the printed solution. So the first question you guys were assigned to hand in is page 170, number 8B. And on this one, you're asked to graph using the x and y intercepts. So the first thing we have to do is to find those two intercepts. And I always write this out and kind of say the x-intercept. What we know about the x-intercept is that at that point, so anywhere along this x-axis on my graph, we know one value. We know that the y value there is 0. So I actually just kind of write that out to remind myself. So for the x-intercept, y equals 0. And then I'm going to go back to my equation and substitute in a y value of 0. So this is 1/4 of x minus 2/3 of y, which is going to be 0, equals 1. The good thing about substituting in a 0 is that multiplying by 0 really gets rid of that term. So negative 2/3 times 0 is just gone because that's 0. And now I have 1/4 times x equals 1 because this whole term is 0. Now I'm just solving a nice little equation to solve for x. I have 1/4 times x equals 1. I know I have to do opposite operations because this is like a dividing by 4. I'm going to multiply by 4 on both sides. And this multiply by 4 and divide by 4 will cancel out. So I'm left with just x on the left, and that equals 4. So that tells me that the x-intercept of this graph is 4. I'm going to do the same thing for the y-intercept. For the y-intercept, I know that the opposite is true. X is equal to 0 because all of the points on the y-axis have an x value of 0. So I'm going to go back to my original equation again, the 1/4 times x minus 2/3 times y equals 1. And I'm going to put in, just kind of separate these two pieces, I'm going to put in an x value of 0. So 1/4 times 0 minus 2/3 times y equals 1. And then the opposite thing happens. This 1/4 times 0 is gone because anything times 0 is 0. So I'm left with negative 2/3 times y equals 1. This equation we're going to have to do a little bit more to solve for y because we've got a dividing by 3 or a fraction. We can multiply both sides of this equation times 3 to clear the fraction. So that will get rid of the 3 on the bottom, and then I'm left with negative 2y equals 1 times 3 is 3. And then dividing by negative 2 on both sides, I get y equals negative 3/2. Remember, we always write up the negative signs on the top of a fraction instead of on the denominator. In this one, this is an exact value. To graph it, you're probably going to want to think about this in terms of decimals. So it's better form to leave things as a fraction, but when we actually go and graph this, we're going to want to know that that's negative 1.5 because we're going to need to be able to estimate that on a graph. So in general, we're going to leave our answers as fractions, but when you go on to do the graph of it, if it's not a whole number, you're okay to estimate that as a decimal because you have to know where to put it on your graph. So a number of things I want to talk about with the graphing. First of all, we have 2 points here. One of the most common issues I see people make is seeing an x value of 4 and a y value of negative 3/2 or negative 1.5 and going to your graph and saying, okay, x is 4, y is negative 1.5. Now this is like a do not do this kind of thing. Saying I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4 in the x and negative 1.5 in the y and making a point there. That's not what we've got here. We have 2 separate points. This is the x-intercept and this is the y-intercept. You can't just say, oh, x is 4 and y is negative 1.5 because that's only 1 point. That is not even a point on the line and it doesn't give you enough information to graph with. So I might go back to this part here and rewrite this really clearly as a point. We knew that x was 4 when y equals 0. And we know that y is negative 1.5 when x equals 0. So that's x is 0, y is negative 1.5. So now we see we've got 2 separate points. Those are not two pieces of one same point. You have to graph those each on the x and y axis. So the first point I have is 4 and 0. So I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4 over and 0 up and down. That's my x-intercept. And then the other point is 0, negative 1.5. So those are my intercepts. I've gotten them on my graph, but there's a lot of stuff that I'm still missing if I want to get full marks for communication and showing my work here. So one thing is that I have to draw arrows on my graph on these axes, and I have to label it. I have to say that this is my x-axis and this is my y-axis. If it was a word problem, then I would label it differently. I might label it time and cost or whatever the variables were there. The next thing is that I have to label a scale. So you don't have to label all of the numbers, just kind of enough to show what you're counting by. So I'm counting by ones on this scale on my graph paper. If you don't have graph paper at home, Mr. Young posted up a picture of how you can use 2 sheets of line paper and kind of turn one sideways underneath so that you can see the lines and still be able to get an accurate grid. So make sure you're doing that if you don't have graph paper. Another option, if you have access to a printer, is that you could use printer paper and print out some pictures of graph paper on that. That's also an option you have. So once I get these points, I've got arrows on the end of my axes. I have the x and the y labeled. I've labeled a scale. I can put in some negative numbers here too. You don't have to label all the way up, just enough to kind of show. So I have my 2 points. Now I'm going to connect them. I need to use a ruler. We're drawing straight lines, so we need to make sure that they're actually straight. So I'm going to put a ruler between those 2 points. If you don't have a ruler at home, I bet that you have something straight. Anything that can help you draw a straight line, like a box of spaghetti from your cupboard, or a book, or the side of your calculator, maybe if it's straight, the edge of your textbook, the edge of a binder. You've got something in your house that makes a straight line, and that's what you can use to draw that. So notice that when I drew this through, I put arrows on the end because that shows that lines keep going for forever. And I'm going to ask you guys to start getting in the habit of labeling your lines. So 1 over 4x minus 2 over 3y equals 1. That's not as important right now if we're graphing one line on one graph, but later in the course, we're going to be graphing more than one line on the same graph. And then it's really important to label which one is which. So that's number 8. Please message your teacher if you have any questions, but we hope that that will make it more clear what the expectations are for this type of question on your unit test.